getting close to passing away, I told my dad that I wanted to pray with him before he died because Phil was the greatest man that I had ever known. And my dad looked at me and said, you know, a lot of other fathers would be disappointed that you would say that, but not me, because quite frankly, Phil was the greatest man that I knew. And, you know, I've gotten a little older since then, not too much older, but a little bit. And I realized platitudes like things, who's the greatest man ever, they're kind of hard to define and quite frankly aren't definable at all. And so I will back away from my statement a little bit and say that the competition between them is still going. And if you know my dad and Phil's relationship, quite frankly, the competition was more important than a victory anyway. My first digression will be, you need to ask my dad about being Joe Cool. I think at one point in time, my dad thought it'd be a good idea to take a macho picture of himself. So he dressed up in something and had a picture taken and signed at the bottom, Joe Cool, and mailed it to Phil. Then Phil, of course, being Phil, took a picture of himself with his leg up on the table and his shirt unbuttoned to his navel, chest out, and said, Joe Cooler. But I think about both of those men. I think about what made Phil so remarkable, and quite frankly, what makes my dad so remarkable is the ability to overcome adversity. And I'll also preface, I've cleared most of these topics with him, so we'll talk about it. But my dad has overcome so much to be where he is today. And I thought about what it takes to do that, and it takes three things. Here's my outline. It takes drive, it takes talent, and it takes love. My dad has more drive than anyone I have ever met. There are just some people who just get stuff done. Floyd Valentine's phrase that my dad would repeat probably once a week when I was growing up is that there's a difference in making noise and getting something done. My dad could get something done. And I'll shift into sort of the first story about overcoming adversity and getting something done, which isn't Baptist related, but it tells me so much about who my dad is. All of you, or most of you, know that my dad is divorced and remarried to a Loretta who's absolutely amazing. And I have later on to talk about how much patience you must have, but I'm going to go ahead and do that now. You have an amazing amount of patience. But in the mid-'80s, my dad was a divorced Baptist preacher. And in the mid-'80s, that means that he probably wasn't a Baptist preacher anymore. And I'll talk a little bit about the kind of father he was through that. We're all very close to my dad. My brother and I are very, very close to my dad. Probably very few of you know that no matter where Dad worked until I was old enough to drive, every 2 to 3 weeks, again, wherever he was, he would drive and pick my brother up and take us to the ranch so that we would participate and learn what it's like to grow up in that kind of life. And so that's when I tell people where I'm from, I tell them I'm from Petty Rock, Texas, because that's where I'm from. That means my dad drove 8 hours on Friday and 8 hours on Sunday, every 2 to 3 weeks for 13 years, just so he could be with us. And that's an amazing commitment. And it shows that even though he had come to a point in his life where, for things in his own control, not decisions that he had made, he had run into a major roadblock, he would not let that keep him from being a good father, and would not let that keep him from being a part of our lives. And that kind of drive, that kind of commitment, really explains who he is. I promise you it's just because I'm sick. And so what does that drive look like? I think it looks like an openness and willingness to overcome. And it also looks like the work ethic necessary to make it happen. And that is who my dad is. In the mid-'80s, here he is, he's working at the ag department. I think they asked him at one point in time, he just started at 5,
6 to 8 a year.
So he needed to start 6 to 8 farmers markets a year. He started 50 in his first year. That's who he was. And yet, even though his path that he thought he was on, that he thought God was leading him toward, was not where it was, he remained open to listen. And sure enough, the opportunity arose through his relationship with Phil at a minimum, and with many of you in this room, to start working with Oida. I forget Oida's last name, but Oida with Ultimate, thank you, with Baptist Committed. And I remember I don't know were you in San Angelo when you started or not, I don't recall, but I do recall the little shack behind the house, which is your office. It had this, I don't know how old I was, so my perception of how large the room was is probably off, but it sure seemed like you could basically type here and turn here and get stuff out of his files and then come back. It may have been a little bit bigger than that, but it wasn't much bigger than that.
Had no windows.
No windows. So, and the Texas, he would sit in there and work and type and count votes and the other things that have been talked about today. We talk about his work ethic, the tireless hours that he put into this work, the immense amount of travel that he did. I wrote down, because I asked him right before we started here what one experience was like. He told me one week was, he started speaking in San Marcos at noon. He then went to San Antonio Monday night. He then spent the night in Hillsboro, and then he spoke in Paris, Texas at the next noon. I forget what day we are on now, but you're getting the point. He then goes to Sulphur Springs Tuesday night. So he went to 4 cities in about 24 hours, it looks like. Then he flew to Nashville for 2 days. Then he landed, spoke in Fort Worth, and went home. And that was his life for years, as we were in the middle of that battle. And so, again, you know, the first thing that my dad has that I think is necessary to accomplish the things that he's accomplished is drive. The second is talent. My dad was very good at his job. He is incredibly good at his job. And every year I loved going to the convention. And what I recall more from the convention than the speakers, though the speakers were wonderful, was standing in the back of the room as we plotted, sounds like a bad word, but it's not a bad word, but we strategized, we talked, we thought about how's the best way to convey a message, how's the best way to get people excited about something that they need to be passionate about. And man, those are smart conversations. Listening to Phil and Dad talk and try to figure out how to convince people what it means to be a Baptist and how to preserve that. And so I absolutely loved going to that. But he was good. You've asked what he does. He trades in influence. I don't know. He trades in trust, I guess is the best way to put it. And he counted votes. I mean, he would be so on sometimes, people would, their jaw would drop whenever he walked in the room. Knew exactly what was going to happen when. And you know, he just had got stuff done. An amazing organizer. I'm not sure there were very many people, certainly not very many people who spoke that he didn't know. I mean, he knew everybody that went to the convention for the most part, or at least somebody from every single church. And he had some relationship with them in some way. And he was able to use that to get done what he done. But he just was incredibly good at his job. And we've said it in many different ways. I think we've had others use the word ethos. I'm from West Texas. I don't need to use fancy words like that. But Texas Baptists would not be free before my father.
Amen.
It wouldn't be. You know, my favorite verse, or one of my favorite verses, is Galatians 5:1. It's for freedom Christ has set you free. And so I thought of that verse as I was thinking about this, and I thought about also the famous speech from Truett that tolerance is a gift from man, freedom is a gift from God. My dad is a champion for Christ, for freedom. That's what God put him here to do. And he took that mantle and he ran with it. The last thing I wanted to say, besides talent, is love. I mean, he was passionate about this work. Next thing I had on my list was Michael Bell's story. You know, I've stole my thunder a little bit, but I'll tell it from my perspective. We were, I'll never forget that moment. It was you all know, it was the first time that an African American was running for president. And he was being imposed. I don't think the man, I know the man well, I still love the man, I had a great deal of love for him, but I don't think it was any other reason that had anything to do with Michael. But still, the optics were terrible. The first time that an African American ran was the first time we had competition in a long time. And they crossed each other in an alcove going into the room. I think Dad was walking out and Michael was walking in, or maybe vice versa. But the tears streaming down my father's face, it's just a look I'll never forget. I mean, people think of my dad as the bull of the china closet type. And that just wasn't really who he is. I mean, he did all of this out of love. It had nothing to do with, only had a little bit of ego. He does like himself a little bit. I can say that. But he did all this out of love. And because he loved being a Baptist so much, and instilled that in everyone he was around, and I will actually go back and tell a story about those car rides, those 8-hour car rides. That was my training unit. I'm one of probably the only people in my generation who knows what training unit is, which I'll talk later is an absolute tragedy, but we would talk about why he was doing what he was doing and why it was important. And we would talk about faith, and we'd talk about life and school and everything on those 8-hour trips. So send Eric Nadell and the Rangers in between commercial breaks, talking about freedom. But he absolutely loved what he did. And he loved it because it was important. Again, I've been trained to be biased, but in my view, freedom of conscience is the greatest gift that God has given us. And we have to fight hard not to squander it, and Dad made that fight. So this is a good point in my presentation. I'm near the end to say that while the battle has changed, we talked about that some. And maybe people don't like terms like battle, but that's ultimately what it is. It's no less important. It's just changed where it happens. And I hope all of you, when you go back to your churches today, it probably doesn't need to be said in this room, but it probably needs to be reminded that you go back to your church and commit to reminding people what it means to be a Baptist. In my view, every single church ought to have a class kind of like training union. I mean, you ought to have a Sunday school class where before you turn 18, someone's told you why you're a Baptist. I mean, most people don't have any idea. 18 years old, have no clue what it means to be a Baptist and why we are the way that we are and why we made the decisions that we have. And I think that's sorely lacking in our churches, and that's why the fight has gone the way that it has, where people keep saying, why is this important? Well, no one has taught them why it's important. And so I hope all of you will commit to doing that. The last thing about love I want to say is that my father loved all of you a great deal. Loves all of you. You do speeches like this one still alive. It sounds like a eulogy. It's not a eulogy. He's still here. He still loves all of you a great deal. But I mean, he was as committed to doing this because God put people in his life that inspired him as much as he was able to inspire them. You cannot talk about my father without talking about Phil. You can't talk about him without talking about Dr. Reynolds, Mr. Ball. I mean, that's who my dad is. And so he loved you all very much and loves you all very much. And I believe that God is going to twist his arm and make him do something else in Baptist life fairly soon. So we'll see what happens. So I wanted to just end again by thanking everybody. This is where having Mal, I'm thanking you, Lorena. We've talked about perseverance, stallness, patience is so right. If you know my dad, privately, patience is so right. So thank you for your immense amount of patience and for your love. My dad, I want to thank you. I don't know if you're the greatest man I've ever known, but you're certainly my hero. So thank you. Thank you for all of your work, and thank you for being my father.